The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I'm going to be joined by Heico Sandee, who is the founder and CEO at Smart Robotics. And Smart Robotics is focused on bringing smart robots, I'm sure, right? But they're focused on robotic arms in the warehouse themselves and bringing those in for multiple different applications within there. And we're going to dive into a little bit about the background in Smart Robotics, how Heico came to found the company. And we're also going to talk a little bit, too, about some of the generational differences that are happening, I guess, in business in general and in our society, but also specifically within the warehousing industry, and how robotics and automation are helping to address some of those challenges, and how Smart Robotics is going about that specifically. And we'll also dive a little bit into robotic arms themselves and kind of the evolution of those. So, Heico, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me in the show.
Absolutely. Excited to get you on. Excited to talk about this. Why don't you start? Give us, I guess, a little brief overview of Smart Robotics and tell us, too, how you kind of came to found this company and came up with this idea and, you know, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me start, I guess, from my personal sort of roots. So I started doing a lot of robotics projects, so in multiple companies, and basically through that discovered that the world of robotics, mainly driven by manufacturing robotics, where still the majority of the robotics are placed, is very much a project business where robots are designed and programmed basically for one specific single task only. And that makes it super difficult to have a robot functioning in a much more complex environment. And examples of these are, for instance, environments where we also live in, like in a world, like in a museum or at an airport. But you also have these environments where it still is very much in a sort of a production atmosphere, but still there's a big variety, and that's where logistics is one of them. So logistics, look at a specific logistics company, like an e-commerce company, you'll see hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different items, different products that all needs to be packed in different packages. It all needs to be stacked neatly in a tight container to be shipped with as less air as possible. And these are actually big challenges for a robot, which you cannot just then program for one specific task only. And that's where AI comes in, and that basically was the big driver for me starting this company. Basically taking what's out there in AI, tailoring that for robotics, and making sure that the robots are actually able to fulfill much more difficult tasks than a single task only. Being able to handle the variety in tasks, in the motions it needs to make, in the items it needs to be able to recognize and handle. And that's where on all these facets AI comes in.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's very interesting too, as you talk about, how the robot itself kind of has like one use case, right? And that's like limiting in a sense a little bit for the warehouse specifically, because there's a lot of different things happening. And, you may look at something like a robotic arm and say, oh, well, why can't it also do this and this and this, right? Because there's, similar motions and things of that nature, and, pick up, put down, right? Similar actions. But, I think now I kind of understand the name of the company now, Smart Robotics, right? Because essentially, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but essentially you're bringing in the AI aspect and, creating that robot to be multifunctional in a sense. Is that right? To make it smart, essentially.
Yeah, that's very correct. If you if you look at the transitions that have already been sort of executed in the logistics space, in the warehousing space, is that so for many years already we see a lot of conveyor and conveyor alike technology in these warehouses that has moved the past decade into quite a bit of AGVs, so autonomous vehicles entering the warehousing space, essentially already being robots, right? But still looking at these warehouses, it's the manual tasks that are still, well, let's say from 99.5% being done manually. And you'll see these manual handling tasks at all kinds of places in the warehouse. So where goods arrive, where they are unloaded from the pallets, typically heavy lifting. And then you get the storage, bins need to be filled, or racking needs to be filled with all these cartons and bins. Then you got order picking, so consumer places an order, and on all these individual items need to be brought together and neatly packaged into a shipping carton, which again is a manual task. And then at the end of the warehousing line, you have all these parcels that need to be stacked either inside a trailer or on top of a pallet, all neatly Tetrised basically. And all of these different tasks require a similar level of automation, but are all very different from one another, basically.
Yeah, I think it's interesting there because it is, you think about the human in a sense, right? It's, the human can easily go from one task to another task, right? With the same end effectors, I guess we could say, right? Or grippers, our hands, right? And be able to do that. And, you need to, I guess, to get robotics and automation to be able to pick up some of those tasks and have that same type of flexibility. There needs to be a lot of different systems or software behind that robot to actually make it smarter in a sense, to be able to think in multiple different ways. So it's interesting how you've brought that to the table and thought about that in a sense. So I guess let's talk a little bit about that aspect, right? The human aspect in itself, because we see, obviously the traditional way of doing warehousing, right, is there's a lot of manual work, a lot of picking up of boxes, putting down of boxes, picking individual pieces, labeling things, a lot of manual activity there. So I guess tell us a little bit about, from a generational perspective, how are we seeing kind of a shift in generations, and how is that really like impacting the workforce in the warehousing industry?
Yeah, there's currently quite a big shift going on, and it's mainly with the generation that basically grew up using their phones every minute almost, I guess. This generation is much more used to be flexible, to develop themselves continuously, to get the best quality out of life. And there's more of these aspects that are quite a bit different, with a different focus, I'd say, to what we saw before, where we were also beforehand more educated in that also a lot of stuff just needs to be dealt with, just needs to be done. There's a greater more openness to actually just do a lot of the maybe a bit more boring stuff, but just to get it done attitude. And then if you relate these two to the warehousing, but also, I guess, in other areas, for instance, in factories or also other areas, it means that it is becoming more and more difficult to find the people that actually can do this quite repetitive jobs in these warehouses, because it's really like every 5 seconds you're picking and placing the same or a similar box. So whereas we've just spoken that for a robot, this might be a challenging task compared to the previous tasks in automation. For a human, it's like a very boring, but also actually a physically very demanding task. And it's becoming more and more difficult exactly at these places in the warehouse where repetition is high and where heavy lifting is also high, to actually staff these spots. So there's an increasing urgency for these companies to look for different solutions, to look for automation, basically, to do those tasks.
Interesting, yeah, and I think there's such a great point there in the the beginning, right? Is that this generation is now here that has grown up with, digitally, just a digital life, basically, right? Grown up with these phones, as you mentioned, in their hands, and just accessibility to any information that they want, and user experience has just been a part of their life, right? It's just, they expect things to be very, very easy in a sense, and not that that's a bad thing, but it's different than what we've seen traditionally in warehousing, right? Especially around maybe systems or processes, the way of doing things. But we still have this, I guess, baby boomer generation, right? In a sense that has, is in the process of retiring, will be phasing out from the workforce and essentially in the next few years, I believe. And, but they still carry kind of that traditional sense of warehousing with them, right? So, and maybe, maybe not as adept or familiar with technology as the newer generation would be, right? So how do we kind of bring some of this traditional warehouse knowledge that, the baby boomer generation is holding in their minds and their experiences, and how do we start to mix that with newer technology to kind of bring these, I guess, generations and this overall transition to the forefront?
Yeah, so I think it actually works very nicely because it's not a stepwise change which is happening. So yes, robots enabled through AI can do a lot more, but that doesn't happen from the one day to the other. So looking currently at the warehouses that we are equipping with robots, it's often still a side-by-side operation where still lots of human labor are doing for the robot the two difficult tasks. So currently it's really both that are needed, but not only helping the robot to do the stuff that which is not capable of, but also basically training the robot to become better in what it is doing. And that's a perfect match with the newest generation, because basically bringing these robots in these warehousing facilities enables them to continuously think about how they can help the robot to become better. They basically have the interface to train the robot in becoming better, basically almost playing around with it, like we are also playing around with, for instance, GPT, to get more knowledge and but also to bring more knowledge to such a learning system. So for me, it's currently a very good match having both capabilities in there. So the baby boomers doing a lot of the work as well, but also the creative minds continuously wanting to improve the operations.
Interesting. Yeah. I think it's an interesting mix. And my experience as a warehouse manager in the past, certainly, had on my team, multiple different generations, and, trying to bring things in and different technologies, and, try to transform some processes. And there's definitely a whole change management aspect to that, you can say, right? To bring in that technology and understand, where the level of acceptance is going to be initially, I guess. And you can see some differences there, I think, in generation. I won't say like broadly as a statement, but certainly, my first job in my career out of school, I was, a 24-year-old and took over a quality control department in a distribution center. And I think the person on my team that had been there the shortest had been at the company like 17 or 18 years, right? So very like ingrained in the processes, ingrained in, this is how we've done it for this long. And, so certainly, some of that generational divide there in a sense, but, it certainly taught me like how to approach these different scenarios and, different ways of thinking. But I think there's a lot of that, that's going to be happening more and is happening now, I'm sure, bringing in, automation and robotics and AI, as you mentioned, into the space. And how do we kind of work around that? And, how do we get these generations to kind of come together to transfer, I guess, the old knowledge, right? The history down, and, and then how do we take that and apply technology and make it better for everybody in a sense. So I guess tell us a little bit about, from Smart Robotics perspective, I mean, how are you trying to kind of address some of these challenges specifically, and how have you dealt with some of maybe the resistance or the challenges around change management as you brought robotics into some operations?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Do you want more warehouse content delivered to your inbox? Sign up for our new email series called Warehouse Wisdom Wednesday to get an educational series of emails on warehouse basics delivered directly to you every Wednesday morning. Find the sign up link in the show notes.
Yeah, so for us, it also meant that we needed to approach our products in a totally different way. So if you look like 10 years ago, the systems that we've put in the field, they basically had lots and lots of tuning parameters, such that the workers that exactly knew how the processes were running were able to tune and tweak the robots into their specific need. That worked by then pretty very well. But with the change of the generations, but also the scale that we wanted to reach with the company, and actually also COVID played a role there, because also it was difficult for our people to actually train our customers by that time how all these individual parameters worked. We moved on to a totally different design paradigm in the user interface, for instance, in which we said we basically only want to have a start and a stop button on the screen. And as soon as there is an exception occurring, then the robot should be able to figure out himself what to do next and how to resolve that potential issue. But of course, it's still limited in its capacity to deal with all kinds of exceptions. So what we typically nowadays do is present the user with hypotheses, mainly visually with pictures, and say, hey, has this been happening? Then could you please change this and this, and then press resume. And then the robot basically tries if it then works. So we went to a totally different system, which basically connects much better towards how we are currently used to deal with the system. Also, if you look, if I'm thinking about how we worked with, for instance, building a web page like 20 years ago, you needed to learn yourself a programming language. And nowadays it's like you click it together and in an hour you have a beautifully looking website. So it's, I think that is sort of expressing what the changes that we have made as well in the control system of the robot.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that ease of use and kind of simplicity, and I like the kind of comparison there to building a website today, right? It's super easy, and I've seen even now there's AI with, you buy a domain and right away like AI is creating the website already for you, basically doing almost all the work. And I think as we bring these newer technologies in, that kind of ease of use and user experience overall becomes more and more important in the warehouse, because once you hit a challenge, in a sense, you kind of get a little frustrated or maybe discouraged with, saying like, oh, this is too much for me. Like, I can't handle this. But on the other end, when you have people in the warehouse that, you want to utilize this technology and have some flexibility around it, they're not necessarily, coming to the table with engineering degrees as a warehouse manager, supervisor. They're certainly not robotics PhDs, right, or anything like that. So, having that ease of use, I think, certainly helps to bridge that gap. So very interesting that you've kind of recognized that and have been focused on that in a sense. So I'm curious too. I want to talk about the robots themselves, because you focused on robotic arms specifically and doing multiple different types of action, like I saw piece picking, palletizing, depalletizing, for example. Why did you decide, I guess, to target that form factor of robot and start to work on that versus maybe an AMR or ASRS or something of that nature?
Well, if you let's say from a distance look at warehousing activities, so what an operator does, then basically it's two things you might say. One thing is doing loads and loads of walking, and the second thing is doing what maybe from a robotic point of view I would call manipulation. So doing things with his hands. And over the past decades, there has been lots of automation already, especially focusing on the walking bit. So think about conveyors, think about AGVs, but also think about these big automated warehousing systems like an AutoStore or another HRS system. Basically, it all comes down to how can we minimize walking, because that just takes a lot of time and is also relatively easy to automate, because it only has a very limited number of degrees of freedom that you need to automate. Whereas if you look at human hands or the human arms and hands with many degrees of freedom, is just sort of the next level of complexity to deal with. As a company, we wanted to take and have taken a leading position worldwide. And that is just a little bit easier if you do it at a more complex level than at the level where lots of automation is already happening. Plus, it is exactly that where AI has a really great advantage, because AI is created to deal with loads of data and to basically structure that data into decisions, into signals that a robot can work with. So if you look at the manipulation tasks in such a warehouse, those are exactly dealing with all these many degrees of freedom that fit so well to an AI system. So basically bringing the technology from the AI into the logistics space with robots is like sort of the match made in heaven if you think of manipulation tasks.
Interesting. Yeah. I think it's very interesting because I know there's been, I guess, maybe some challenges with robotic arms, especially around, like piece picking and, different types of, whether it's like the rigidity of the items it's trying to grab, or the shape or the size. So I think it's interesting you're focused on that, but I think it makes total sense what you're saying. It's one of the big things that a human worker does is manipulation in that sense, right? So how do we bring something to the table that's going to help to augment that and, make that better and take over those repetitive tasks, as you said earlier in the conversation, right? Every 5 to 10 seconds they're pulling some item or something like that, right? So it's repetitive work they're trying to automate here. And I think, I'm curious around that too. I mean, because I think when I, started this podcast, 5.5 years ago in 2019, robotics was just kind of like coming out. It was very much concept in that sense, especially around like robotics arms and, the accuracy, I guess, of a robotic arm, especially around piece picking, was not so high, I guess you would say. So talk to us a little bit about kind of the evolution of the robotic arm and how it's kind of progressed over these years, and specifically, I guess, give us some thoughts on like accuracy around piece picking as well. How has that changed over the last 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, good question. Because if you currently look at the warehouses, there still aren't a lot of piece picking robots in the field. Mm-hmm. It's still very much in a piloting stage, I would argue. That's basically also the reason that we as a company said, let's not only focus on piece picking, but also focus on the picking challenges elsewhere in the warehouses, typically where boxes are handled, because obviously these are easier to handle. But still, if you look at the warehouses, most of these tasks are also still being done manually. So that's why we are targeting and doing both. And we do see more traction in the field on the boxes, on the parcel picking and stacking compared to item picking. But at the same time, we also see that the technology is still growing rapidly, as we also see with the AI. Every quarter, we see new things being enabled through AI, which is also still the case with item picking. So if you look at item picking, or as I guess 2 years ago, we were able to pick like 75-80% from the flow of a general e-com warehouse. Currently, we see these numbers increasing from towards 85-90%. Still, I agree, it's not 100%, but I think that's also a little bit general in if you want to automate things, you shouldn't try to automate 100% of your process at once, because it's just better to start with the more standard stuff to automate. And exactly if you were able to separate, let's say that the 85% of pickable flow of items from your warehouse and route these towards the automated stations and the robots, and basically pick the remaining 15% with manual pickers, then we are, as a company, but also the market, let's say, is very well capable of achieving very high KPIs, which is ready to scale. And this is also what we currently see happening. So currently, we do have the installations, the customers that are buying robots 5 to 10 after having tested with the first one and the first 5. So scale is happening. Still with the launching customers, but we see that the market and the technology is basically getting ready to go faster in this market.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to see that increase too. I mean, going from, we said around 70 to 80%, right, and then to 85 to 90% in just over a year or so time. I mean, it's a pretty big jump, right, in terms of improvement, right? And I think it's interesting too to see, I guess, as the AI behind it, right, is driving a lot of that kind of decision making and, telling the robot essentially what to do, similar to like our mind is, I guess, telling me what to do with my hand right now, right? In a sense, as it sees more and gets more use cases, it's going to have more experience, I guess, to be able to do that, right, and develop more and be able to handle more different scenarios and use cases and things of that nature. So very interesting there. And, I guess when a company says, we want to start to get some automation or robotics and they approach smart robotics, I mean, what is that process like? And, how do you typically guide them in a sense? Where would you maybe look at putting an application for them first to really get started on kind of that journey?
Yeah, so if you look at a robot in a warehouse, you typically are positioned in the middle of a process. So there's goods arriving at the robot and goods feeding away from the robot, which basically means that you will need to integrate that robot quite tightly into the whole existing system. So from a transition point of view, from the one station to the other, also from a safety point of view, also from a monitoring point of view. So there's loads of interfaces that need to be dealt with. So whereas a first setup in how you could place a robot in the field might look quite straightforward, it's especially in carefully thinking about how to integrate the robot in the complete system, where we are putting most of our efforts. And that is typically going hand in hand between us and the end user, but also with the system integrator involved, who typically has already set up a specific system and with whom we are interfacing in the field. So typically in such a journey, of course, the first question is, and we touched on this a little bit already, is that the customer and we need to know the percentage of the flow that the robot is able to deal with. So basically that is done through some first tests, which goes quite quickly. And then afterwards, it's the whole design that we create together with the customer to have, in the end, the whole system working well. Maybe with a little bit of an example, we've just placed a robot into a warehouse where it needs to pick from an AutoStore system. And the worker that did that before basically not only did the item picking, but also took the shipping carton from a conveyor, prepared it a little bit, and then moved it to, when after packed and scanned, moved this one towards another conveyor line. So apart from the robot, it's also about adding some integration works to have the robot functioning in its environment and not only doing the picking. So that's, I think, also a little bit what I see changing in the market as well, whereas like 5 years ago, where we as well, but also the other players in the market and each picking try to deliver the standard system to the end user. So this is the robot, sort of good luck with it. That we are now taking more and more the approach as sort of, let's say an integrator, which is able to integrate the robot with the surrounding peripherals also required to deliver the complete system, which basically replaces the operator, which was there in the beginning.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too. You mentioned the robots kind of going in the middle there, but you're seeing these different applications too. And I think I think that's great that you're able to pair with other automation solutions as well to kind of create that collaborative, I guess, automation solution in a sense to be able to address, because you put in one automation or robotic system, that doesn't mean that you don't have other issues or other manual processes that are surrounding that, right? So to be able to come in and fill some of those gaps, I think is a really good thing. So very interesting stuff to talk to you about here, Heico, today, and really appreciate you coming on the show and teaching us a little bit more about smart robotics and talking to us about the generational gaps and, how we kind of help to close them a little bit with technology and, combining that and mixing that with some of the traditional knowledge as well. Very interesting, very, very insightful. So definitely appreciate you coming on the show today. If people are interested in learning more about smart robotics, what's the best way to do that?
Just Google Smart Robotics and you'll find us. So feel free to send me an email or just send an email to what's mentioned on smart-robotics.io.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well so people can easily find it. So, Heico, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.